Um, welcome, welcome, welcome. There we go. Recording is in progress. Um, Great. So right now, if you're tuning in, um, you're probably watching this, maybe with a group of people, maybe by yourself. Um, what I'm hoping is that you're doing it in a curious, joyful way. Because I feel like that's what we're about. That's what we're gonna get into in a bit. Before we get into more stuff, I do want to do something strange that I don't usually do, and it's covering logistics first, right? If you know like my chart, you know that logistics is usually like just intuitive. But I'm gonna name some things here, right? So first is I'm so glad you're here. You could have chosen to be anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us, either live right now, or you're viewing this record in a recorded way, right? And something that you can watch recorded things into. My name is Luis Alejandro. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the network doula for the Illuminate Network, right? I am located in so-called New York City, Lenape Hoking, land of the Lenape. And I am wearing a denim shirt over a white shirt. I have a beard, blue glasses, and my locks are twisted up in some sort of bun concoction there. And behind me, my background is other members of the Illuminate Network that are always with me in the work that I do. And so for tonight, we'll be definitely using the chat for a little bit. I might turn them off just to not distract us from some of those things, but definitely we'll go back into them towards the end to possibly ask some questions here or just give shout outs or just shower us, especially our guest, um, Vanessa Mason, with some love, right? Logistics. Um, and so illuminate why we're here is part of the logistics as well. And so this work that we're doing here through the webinar series is about several things, and I'll name some of them now, right? The work that we're doing here through this series is really to amplify the voices and perspectives of, yeah, voices and perspectives that may challenge the status quo of perceived wisdom, roles, and actors, specifically in the systems change field, right? Part of that work is also clarifying social justice and equity as elemental to systems change work. In our time together, we're also hoping to and intending to harvest practices, resources, learning, insight about systems change, power, and justice from the work, right? Here, live, in person, and recorded. And to spark international conversations about power and systems change field and the connection between the role of equity and justice in changing systems. And so through those intentions, we're looking to create new understanding in the field of systems change culture, to build connections between healing work, somatic work, justice work, community work as systems change work, and to nourish the global ecosystem of folks like you, like myself, like Vanessa. So no small feat. We're into some things here, right, Vanessa?
Yes.
And so, Vanessa, I said your name a few times. I'd like to introduce you, if I may, and then I'm gonna ask you to like introduce yourself too, right? If I miss anything, which I'm sure I will. And so, Vanessa, congratulations, is in a new role, right, as principal of building cultures of belonging on the programs team at Omidyar Network, and which, if you have not subscribed yet, Google Vanessa Mason, go to her newsletter. She's also has a huge, huge work on her newsletter, Future Belonging, that explores how we can redesign tools and remodel approaches to fulfill the basic human needs for belonging over the next decade as loneliness, alienation, and exclusion becomes more pervasive, right? Um, I know you're in San Francisco, currently, has lived in Mozambique, in Argentina, in Brazil, is a creative, is a writer, um, is an ideator, right? And is also stylish. Loves whiskey, loves wit, loves some Afrobeat, and all music of the African diaspora. And I'll say it again: if you have not gotten into like bullet journaling, Vanessa Mason will like help you understand why it's a way of life. Vanessa, welcome. Thank you so much. Tell us, um, tell us more about yourself, and I'd love to for you to do it. Maybe start doing it in the context if you know me, you know.
Yes. Oh, well, you've like said so many things about if you know me, you would know. I guess like the one thing that maybe I would like pull a thread on is that like yes, my love of the music of the African diaspora is also in my kind of love for dance. So I am not a formally trained dancer, but dance is something that has been pervasive like throughout all of my adult life. So West African dance, salsa, reggaeton, samba, like I have done it all and like done some performances. I was in San Francisco Carnival like this year, dancing samba for like two-ish, almost 3 hours. And so that for me is like a really amazing way of like, I always loved music, but really getting into like the body and getting grounded and like what it is to feel what music brings up. So I think that's a good bridge. If you know me, then you know that I love dance.
And thank you, thank you. And I'm also curious to know, Vanessa, um, if you could share a bit about your work, um, a bit about your, I would say your inquiries, right? Beyond, I would say, paid work. Uh, and also, I'd love to know, right? So in that, I'm giving you like some things as non-linear in whatever order you'd like. I'd also like to know about what are some of the questions that guide your work. And so take your time. I'm gonna get comfortable.
Get comfortable. So I'll try to weave all of these together and choose sort of systems thinking. So one thing is that when I think about belonging, it sort of looks like the target bullseye. Like there's a center circle, a sort of middle one, and then an outer one. So when I think about the center one and belonging, it really revolves around like how we think of ourselves and our closest relationships. And I think with me and how I got to belonging. It was from a personal inquiry and a personal feeling of not belonging. I wonder if it's like for the same for all of you that are curious about systems change, if there's something about either encountering a system or sort of uncovering a system or having maybe a, sort of unexpected way of seeing systems that kind of got you into systems change. And so, I think from a personal aspect, as someone who was born in Texas but didn't have family who was from there, who was Black in a predominantly white school, who kind of fell into being a very Catholic person by virtue of kind of being surrounded by like the Bible Belt. I've sort of spent like the earliest parts of my life like trying to figure out like where I belong. And so, if that's you and you're thinking about belonging, this might be like thinking about your identity, what place that you are in, like how do you think about your closest relationships and what closest relationships you might have. And so I think in my work and as I think about belonging, it sort of lives in somewhat more of those outer two circles. Of course, like everything in some respect is personal, but as I think about the sort of second circle of communities and networks, like what sort of communities and networks do all of us have access to? How do we show up in them? How do those communities and networks shape who we are and also create opportunities for us to fully be ourselves? Are all questions that kind of show up in belonging. And I think are questions that are on the top of everyone's mind, especially living in the country that we live in, living in this current moment in time that we are living in with kind of multiple crises happening a lot. I would also say in my personal pursuit of belonging, like as much as my last job was in futures research. And so we're used to looking out over this huge landscape and trying to understand these massive undercurrents of change, and also maybe some like very weird innovations or disruptions that may be happening underneath that point to a different way that we might understand things. And for a while, I was looking out on the landscape and I was like, wow, this looks really negative. But like that part of me, that inner part of me and that personal part says, there has to be more than this. It can't just be that we're all kind of screwed. We're all on this path. That there's something about intrinsic to being human, and even more importantly, intrinsic to the different ways that all of us show up as humans. That points to ways in which we're seeking belonging differently, that belonging might look differently, that it might serve different purposes, that it might be responding to different needs. And so that is really that kind of like optimistic bent to how do we think about new communities? How do we think about networks that might be advancing more positive social change? And then that last circle of like narratives and culture, like what are the values and the norms and, the stories that we tell about who we are, who belongs, and why we belong, that are really undergirding a lot of this. Like how is sort of that the air that we breathe, the water we swim in, changing in ways in which that support more belonging. And so that's really that macro, and that's definitely really where a lot of like where the systems work lives in, or a lot of my work is how can we think about shifting and leveraging culture? How can we think about shifting narratives and thinking about the sort of infrastructure, like that narrative infrastructure that's underlying how we understand the world and how we structure the world? And so on a futures respect, that gets into like world building and like Afro futures and indigenous futurities and like all sorts of very cool, amazing speculative spaces. But it really is about this question about what is possible in terms of how we experience being human. And that to me is like a really intriguing question and an intriguing place to be in.
I want to pull on some of the threads there. Okay, so you closed out, and it's an interesting time to be doing that, right? And so I want to link that to these conversations in the field of systems change, and not just in the field of systems change, but everywhere, right? A lot of energy around equity, right? Around inclusion, specifically during this time, right? And folks are seeing it as like also as an opportunity, like this time as an opportunity to do the things that we are saying or saying that we're going to do those things, right? And it does feel like a time where traditional, let's say, quote unquote, dominant narratives and practices are coming into question on a larger scale, right? And so you gave us an example of you kind of like, okay, I'm using this methodology because that's what we do, but inside, and like seeing the results of that and seeing how that, like that framework also affects the way that you look at your work, and having to from inside, you'd be like, something in me, I have to be able to see something else from this, right? I can't just believe that thing to be true. And so in a way, kind of like disrupting, right? Where normally you'd be like, okay, so I guess if that's how we use this tool, and that's the result of using this tool, then the next step is already laid out for you. And so in a way, you're disrupting, you're challenging, questioning some of the methodology that's being even used in that research, right? And so I'm wondering for you, right? And I'm connecting to Mama Morrison. I know Toni Morrison is with you, behind you, right? She spoke about her work, what it meant for her to do her work without the white gaze, right? And then from there, she kind of was able to articulate how, from that moment, she's like, oh, I could write about anything, anywhere, to anyone from anywhere, right? And so I'm wondering for you if like what does that mean for you? Because it sounds like you're in a practice around that, that you're like, okay, I hear you saying to look at something this way, but I'm choosing, right, given what I know and who I am and all those parts, to look at something a little bit different, right? And therefore to create something different. And so I said a lot of stuff there. Um, but I'm wondering what's sticking, what are you looking to like pull from there?
Yeah, I think at least the way that I've started thinking about it, it's a way of practicing the future, right? Like all of us, or not, I can't, I guess all of us is a really overly broad term. Most of us have been in some form of formalized schooling, which means that we have been taught how to think, we have been taught what we are supposed to know, and we have been taught what we are supposed to ask about and what we are supposed to accept. And I think that bringing it back to like belonging is a fundamental human need, I feel like part of being human is yes, those structures and that predictability help us move through the world. They help us be safe in some ways and obviously not others. But part of being human is observing and noticing what is happening, even if things that are supposed to be predictable and structured are either like functioning or not functioning. So I think part of this space of both accept like being in a place of that liminality, like of knowing something, of trusting that what was in the past is true, is holding space for, well, but maybe there's something else that's true. In the same way that you are a child growing up, you go to school and you learn about shapes. But then when someone introduces you to fraction, you don't go, oh, well, that can't be true. It's not that it's true or not true, or that you have to choose based on what you already know. It simply is something that was out of your sphere of knowledge and is simultaneously existing in the world, but you just personally weren't aware of it. So trying to hold that attitude that, yes, there are things that I know to be true and they are useful for some things. Like I'm someone who identifies with that kind of like a very like analytical and scientific mindset. And so there are things about like the scientific method and understanding data that are undoubtedly useful. And I also know that that particular perspective and orientation will never be able to explain everything. It can explain some things, it can support some things, it can, help me understand some things. But, in the same way that like I knew about shapes, like something that might be fractions that's outside of the sphere of knowledge or experience that I have, also both could be true and could be useful to help me do something that I don't know how to do or that I might be curious about, or maybe that I don't, that is because it's outside my sphere of awareness that I don't even realize that I want or want to ask about. And so I think having that attitude of not looking for right and wrong, not operating in binaries and being like, well, this is going to tell me what is true and what is false. I forget who wrote about this, but I think it's like Showing Up for Racial Culture has like a graphic that they have that are all about aspects of white supremacy. And like part of it is like the notion of like being perfect, the notion of like objectivity and objective reality, that really impede us from being able to show up in the world and question, but like show up with like healthy questioning. And I think that's again sort of like an underlayer like of this work of belonging is like, belonging isn't going to look and feel the same for everyone. It's not going to be experienced by everyone the same way at any point in time, or it may be different in certain contexts. And holding that all of those things can be true and can be healthy in some respects and also not healthy in some respects, like is helpful, and being able to move this work forward.
Mm. By the way, the graphic and the person, I think the person that you is has usually historically been associated with it, Tema Okun,
Yes,
um,
thank you.
a good friend of ours, uh, and just like put out a dope website. I put the link in the chat there. But yes, that graphic that was a collaboration between Tema and I think yeah, Kenneth Jones, right? That list these characteristics around white supremacy culture, right? And that has anecdotes to it, right? And to be honest, I think when I first say that, since you like named it, when I first read it, I was like, ooh, okay, right. And the okay came from, in similar to you, I do have a strong analytical mind as well. I don't know. Maybe you can tell by some of the questions I'm asking, right? But kind of like I like to prod. I like to kind of like open things up and see how they work and be able to put them back together, kind of like checking myself for comprehension, right? Like I want to know all of it. Um, and so in a way, it provided some sort of framework to understand something that I was experienced but couldn't necessarily articulate, right?
Mhm.
Um, but definitely named the things that like the ways that it showed up in my experience, right?
Yeah. And
In a
I think
really
it also
useful way.
gives you permission to show up differently where you didn't have that before.
Mm, no, sorry. Please go in.
No,
That's
no, that
resonating.
was
Yes,
all.
please keep going.
Yeah. No, I think that that's helpful. The naming and the permission are
Yeah,
helpful.
and a lot of what some folks missed in my experience. Again, I've facilitated some of the session. You know, where we're kind of sourcing that also are the antidotes, right? Like, okay, here are all these things, and here are some opportunities, right? Here are some things that you can, some channels you can kind of like move towards, so that you're doing the work of like moving towards a person, right, and not away.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's interesting. I think that's interesting. So I want to bring this to this theme, um, around complexity. I would say I think we had an initial conversation about like who inspires us, who inspires our work, places that we pull inspiration from. And I was thinking about that conversation we had around complexity and around like systems change, and what is it about the field um that feels um not as inclusive as it thinks it is, right? Not as
Mhm.
equitable as it thinks it is. And really what we're meaning that when we look at the field of systems change, it's very leaning towards a white Western male academic, et cetera, dominant identity, right? And that's interesting because at the same time, I know hella systems change people that might not necessarily like go to a systems change conference, right? Or may not identify
Mhm.
themselves as a person that is in the field of systems change, but the work they're doing, the way that they hold the context of the work that they're doing, right? How it affects all these systems, right? Like housing, legal systems, right? Systems of transportation, et cetera, agriculture, et cetera. Um, the pull is then going to some of what Bell Hooks has said about her work, right? So she's I forgot what talk she was having, and we'll include that in the link here. But she was having a conversation about like that the job is not to try to make complex things easy,
Mhm.
right? That's not the work. The work is not to like make this thing easy, but instead to create pathways that can make those things clear. She was writing about her work as a writer, right? And
Mhm.
so I'm wondering how that connects also, because I see how that connects to the work that you're doing, right? Around belonging, around future work. How, like what's your relationship to that complexity, to who's kind of like wanting to embrace that complexity, and how you're able to start to articulate pathways towards, etc.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So going back again to sort of my past, like in futures research. So I used to work at Institute for the Future. A lot of the work the futures research that I did was focused, like, yes, on health and in healthcare, because my background is in public health, but also because the public part of public health was really looking at equity and belonging. And so something that we would tell folks a lot generally was sort of, you want to work toward clarity, not towards certainty. One, because like no one can predict the future. Like if anyone's telling you they can predict the future, they're lying to you, they're trying to get something from you. And then the other piece of it is that because no one can predict the future, in a certain sense, the second thing is that there are multiple futures. So that sort of, again, that sort of multiplicity, that complexity is like showing up again. And then the other piece of that is that because there are multiple futures, there are multiple pathways to what can come next, means that there are multiple roles for all of us to play in building said things. And so that acceptance of complexity in that respect gives you a certain degree of agency. To your point of talking with folks who don't think that they're systems change folks, I would, I encountered a lot of the same thing in like futures work too. It was like I would work with like social justice organizations or like nonprofits, and they're like, we don't know about this whole futures thing. Like, it seems like that's, for others. And it's like, well, wait a second. All of you are futurists in some respect, because if you were trying to build, if you're trying to craft social change, if you're trying to push social change and advocate, you are trying to tell people that there is a world that does not exist. There is a world in which whatever cause that you are focused on, that we have open borders, that transportation is free and available, that healthcare is universal, whatever it is that your issue that you focus on, you are acting as if that world exists. You are acting as though it is possible, and you are acting as though you and other people have the ability to make that happen. And that is a futures endeavor. You are building the future. You are changing systems. Like, that is the work. Just because you are not using the language of it, you are not showing up the terminology, does not mean that you aren't doing it. I think what happens with a lot of folks that are in these spaces is that there's gatekeeping, whether for implicit reasons because people don't feel like that it's accessible, because sometimes the terminology is like overly arcane and academic, or sometimes it's explicit that people who have an interest in protecting those things, whether because they are in corporate spaces or because they are trying to uphold the culture that benefits them, try to make it seem as though, well, that's not for you. You don't have what it takes. You need to do more, whatever that sort of language that takes place. And so I think the more that we can, again, that like naming and permission space, the more that we can visibilize that people are already doing this work of system change or doing the work of building futures, I think that helps move things forward, and also helps people, again, that I talk a lot about the notion of like belonging before belief. Like, we don't need to know exactly what needs to happen. We don't need to know how we're going to get there before we can sort of be together and be in that space of like, hey, like, there's just some things that we want. There's that advocacy, that sort of collective experience of being in this together, even if we don't necessarily see it yet. A lot of why I like having like a Toni Morrison and like talking about bell hooks is that those were women, and there are countless others, which we could all sit here and name, that were advocating for a world that didn't exist, and a world that they knew that they would probably never see in their lifetimes. And I remember as a child, like learning about that, and it felt so surreal at the time. And like now being an adult, and it's like, that makes so much sense. Like, if you have that both courage of conviction and the support of others in doing this, then how could you not feel both capable and also like energized by doing that, even if you don't personally get to experience that?
There was a reverberating in my household from what you shared. Okay, and then a casual sip, Vanessa, as you drop some bars on us here, huh?
Sure.
Wow. Okay. So many delicious things here. All right, so I'm gonna try to do one at a time, right? One of the things at a time. And then I have some other questions, and then I'm also gonna check the chat in a little bit for some other questions possibly. Huge thing you said here, right? And I want to hear from you about how you get to practice that. I'll call it a principle, right? A principle of practice right now we're talking about, right? And we're you and I, we're starting something new right here. We're starting a section called principles of practice around power, justice, and systems change, right? We're just going to name it that. And one thing that I heard you say there that I automatically want to put on the list here is that we need all of us, right? And so my own lineage around emergent strategy, Adrienne Maree Brown, and that lineage of that work, Octavia Butler, Grace Lee Boggs, right?
Mhm.
Folks that we're seeing into the future and telling us like, yo, look, and you know what? I'm gonna write it, and it's gonna be here in this section of the book, but really, it's all gonna be true, right? And
Mhm.
it's all gonna be true before I pass. Um, in all of these messages and all of that thought and all those frameworks, there is a principle around understanding that what you just said, kind of working back from what you said, right? Like, given that there are so many different people, so many different humans that human in different ways, right? And there's so many different futures that to get to those futures, we need all of us, right? All of us need to participate, to engage in that future that we want collectively, right? And I heard that notion of collective action, of collective understanding that there's multiplicity, and that multiplicity is and diversity is an advantage to getting to the future that is good for all of us, right? So how is that? How do you get to practice that in the work that you're doing? That's
Yeah,
the question.
that is the question.
Right now.
I mean, it's still somewhat of an evolving process. I've been there not even quite 4 months. I will say that to your point around, one, accepting that it's a practice, that none of us are going to do this correctly. Um, Two, that some of it begins with the mindset generally that like even like collective dreaming, collective imagination, like that that space of even allowing yourself to be aware of and entertain a possibility, even if you aren't taking action toward it, is an important space to be in. I think that's why, like now that I'm in this work of system change, having come from futures, it's actually an advantage because I feel myself, and even sometimes when I'm with other colleagues, it's like, oh, I just understand possibility differently, just because I've spent so much time training my mind to accept the fact that there are way more possibilities than we give ourselves credit or even invest time and sort of energy and attention toward.
Hold
Um,
up, hold up. We're gonna pause it and we're gonna slow it down.
yeah,
Go back
go
to
back.
where you or started to say that it might be that you understand possibility differently. Continue.
Yeah, I think understanding, experiencing, and accepting possibility is probably like the first place to be in. So, I'm sure like all of us remember at the very beginning of the pandemic, that first month one, month two, where none of us knew exactly what was going on. It was terrifying. We were all in a very fearful space. Um, but I think what was interesting, at least from like my vantage point, and then from even just like being with my colleagues, is that there was simultaneously like we were all obviously having an emotional reaction to that. Like fear is real, like you're not going to overcome that. And our work also became a space, like a safe space for us to be in, even with being in fear and being like, well, hey, like if this is a crazy thing that, well, not literally no one saw coming, bizarrely enough, like there have been scenarios around this, I've done this work. And then all of these things can come from this like event that is really complex and still unfolding in ways in which we don't understand. Maybe the fear is telling me something, but it's not telling me everything. So I think when we start trying to understand possibility, it's really hard. I think our natural tendency is either to give into the fear, and then it's like, well, we're fearful, so we can't entertain any possibilities, or to say that, well, we're fearful and maybe there's a little bit of a possibility over here, but considering like how much like backlash or how much fear and like all this other stuff going around, we can't possibly focus on that. We have to pull in like how much we are thinking of and dreaming of right now, because we can't afford to think about the future. So not really giving into the fear so much as saying that, like, the whole zone is flooded and we can't do anything else otherwise because there simply is too much. And so I think the more that you can have even that tiny glimmer and have like kind of even have like spaces, even if you aren't fully in there, even if it's only like 5 minutes a day, to be like, these are possibilities that I'm thinking about. Like this is art that I'm inspired by. This is a passage that I'm inspired by. This is poetry that makes me feel something differently. Whatever it is that is evocative of you, that gives you that sense of possibility and dreaming and something else, the more that you can try to carve out space for that, the easier it becomes to then to entertain, well, if something is possible, then why can't it move from being possible to probable? Why couldn't it be potential? Like, sort of, it
Mhm.
allows you to sort of give you space to sort of move beyond that. But you have to start with something, like whatever this something is that you are going to respond to, start with that.
Let's talk about practice, right? You, as you were speaking about, yeah, I mean, as you were sharing about your experiences, how this shows up, um, you put, and I read in parentheses like, oh, remember that it's a practice, right? That you need to, and I received it as you naming something else about like how or what kind of practices you're engaging in, right? And that you're seeing this as like experimental, and not experimental as like superficial, experimental in that you are testing, that you are taking certain risk, that you are also um, creating some sort of way to receive feedback from those experiments, those tests, those risks that you're taking. That's what I'm, when I hear you saying that it's a practice, right? That there's something in you doing the thing that will might provide some learning that you should be paying attention to, right? And that's what kind of makes it a practice. And not
Yeah.
necessarily to be perfect. I'm getting very cliches now, but really to like learn the like to excel at the practice, right? To be good at the practice. Um, and so I want to talk about this other practice around complexity, right?
Mhm.
And when I hear complexity in the way that you're sharing about and the way that you shared about it, I hear about like I also connect that to moving through tension, right? Um or holding contradictions, right? Like the stamina, the stamina that you have to hold contradictions. And I wonder like how does that translate really like in your body? Like what does like what practice do you feel you get or that you think that we can engage in that kind of helps us also understand or at least increase our tolerance to complexity?
Yes. So a couple of things. When I think about the notion of practice, like, yes, there's the experimentation and testing and like learning part of it, but I also think of practice as a series of commitments as well. And so in this sense, when I say like I think about practice as commitment, I don't mean commitment to the practice necessarily, but commitment to yourself and trusting that whatever it is that you are seeking, you will find or it will find you. And so I think that kind of self trust in these practices is both built and also required, but it definitely grows over time. As far as embodied practices, like because I am someone who relates to being scientific and analytical, like I always run to the sort of opposite of that. So I'm drawn to things in which like my mind goes like offline or is necessarily otherwise occupied. It's one of the reasons why I like dance, because dance helps me bridge basically those worlds. Like, yes, there's choreography to learn, which means I need steps, I need to remember order, like it's sequenced to music, like that all has a very like there's categories, there's order, there's a linearity to dance. And my body is moving in time and space, which is not a literacy that is it's not my first literacy, and it's certainly not my best literacy, even despite all these years. Like, I try to tell people, I'm like, I've done dance for years and I am not good. And that is fine. Part of the reason I do it is because I'm doing something that I am intentionally not good at. So again, that's like being in a space of discomfort. It's doing something that feels challenging and complex. And so like that has like some complexity tolerance. It's got some tolerance for failure. It has some degree of tolerance for ambiguity, because no matter how many times I'm running something, it's always a little bit different every time. And I think, again, training our minds and our bodies, and frankly, like our spirits, for like that is a metaphor for life. Whatever your version of dance is in your life, which is challenging how you sort of initially see and approach the world, which is allowing you to feel both uncomfortable but also safe. Like, I think that's important to underline, that it's just not enough to like put yourself in spaces of discomfort. Like, you should also feel safe. And that is something that you can, yes, experiment with, but is also like a commitment that you can make to yourself, and trust that you will get there, wherever the there is, or whatever the there that you're seeking, that you will get there. I think those are all good practices to have. You know, some of my like coworkers, like they're really into running, like that meditative, that repetitive motion, like the long distance running, like really appeals to them. We have, I feel like, an above average number of runners that I've ever worked with before. uh, it's not my calling, but for a lot of people it works. Other people might like things like swimming. Some folks are like meditation, like that idea of like, sitting meditation and having your body be still, and like training and focusing on one breath might be where like that sort of complexity tolerance and sort of tolerance for failure shows up for you. Whatever that thing is that feels like a safe yet uncomfortable challenge, like I encourage you to pursue that. It may not end up being the thing, but again, it'll probably lead you to something that will eventually be it for you.
I love that. Did you tell them like, yeah, that's not my calling, right? Did you say
Yeah.
that? Because now I want to know. Now I want to know what you feel.
Like, I've run a
Not,
half marathon before. It ain't me. I
well,
did
I mean,
it
I'm not
once and
even. I know
yeah.
about your CrossFit too, and I'm like, you know what? I want you to share about your CrossFit, because last time we spoke, you're like, yo, right after this, I'm gonna go get it in, right? Um, but also I want to know about like your calling, right? You haven't necessarily personally told me like, oh, this is my calling here, but I feel like when you share in your discussion around how the work that you do just like makes like literal sense, right, in the analytic logical sense of you.
Mhm.
um but there's also an energy that I feel from you, that really lights up, right? Speaking about how you're able to see um even more possibilities, right? And you did a great job at alliteration before.
Uh,
So extra credit. But there's something that lights you up. And so I want to know um about like, is like, what do you feel your calling is, at least in this work of systems change. And I'm also curious to know about what are some things that you feel like we could be doing, um, to make this work not easier, I would say,
mhm.
but to make it more accessible, to make it something that more people are open to. Um, and I mean open in as many ways as you can think, right? Open into like, you know what, I'm gonna engage with this work that way, right? Like, as thinking about not just like the hyper local, this thing that I want to fix, but also how is this thing connected to everything, right? Like that systemic thinking, that's a huge part of systems change. Um, but also as we're thinking about the field just broadening itself, right? And that not being a detriment to the field, that being really like something that is life affirming and moving towards life of the field. And so I know I said a lot in there, but I know I could to you because I could.
I will do my best. Yeah, I guess I will start with the system change field questions first because I evade personal questions because that feels easier. But I do think to your point about systems change expanding. I mean, I don't love this expression, but I think the sentiment behind it makes sense. So a lot with software development, they talk about the notion of like dog fooding, and it's the idea that you should like use the software that you are developing so that you can understand better what's missing. And so when I think about systems change expanding, I feel like in a certain part, the field seeing itself be stretched and built upon and filled in and having contours of it come out or having it be questioned are that's the version of dog fooding for system change. Like I think that's intrinsic to the field. I think that that's good. When I think about the ways in which I see systems change like showing up and even how I'm trying to figure out like my own work when I think about, I'm building a portfolio around of work, yes, around building cultures of belonging, but more specifically, what I will be focusing on is around repair. So thinking about how can we repair relations in the United States. That's at a lot of different levels, interpersonal, communal, systemic, institutional, like all the sort of ways that you could think of among groups, between groups, like, like all the levels. And so that as a systems change question and proposition, because of that complexity and also because of what the question is thinking about, will naturally will require other tools beyond like the system being able to quantify itself and analyze itself. Like at every node within what I've talked about is an individual, and an individual that will see themselves and also participate in different ways depending on where they are moving throughout the system. And so that kind of both human layer and human overlay, like I think makes it imperative for all of us to see that like analysis is only going to get us so far. Like we need to sort of have systems change that is feeling, have systems change that is visual, have systems change that is, evocative, that is spiritual, that is, calling to something larger than ourselves. Like you have to, because of what the system actually is. It's not a set of trains running on tracks. Like it's ultimately about people and what people value and how people relate to each other. And so I think that sort of learning is both in progress and also something that we are learning how to practice. And so in that respect, I see, looping back to your initial question around my calling, like I think helping to build that practice of systems change, not just, how does the system see itself, but maybe how the system feels itself, how the system like believes in itself. Like a lot of those sort of cultural and spiritual like aspects of that are really something that I'm drawn to. And then I think to get probably like astrological, it's like I'm like a Virgo, but it's like someone has tried to explain this to me before. My Virgo is in the 12th house. It's a Virgo Mercury and a Virgo Sun. And I guess the 12th house is supposed to be of like hidden things and also healing and sort of all like the deep things. And Virgo, as a figure generally was meant to tend to the temple. Like they were the keeper of the secrets, not like the secrets that necessarily need to be hidden, but like the secrets of sort of like the larger spiritual kind of cosmological world, like tending to like those sort of temples. And so when I think about it in that sense, it's like, how can I help the world see the secrets that it is eager to understand and also wants to hold? So like kind of being that person to tend to that.
Oh, right now I don't see anyone else better suited than you. Um, wow, and you shared a few of them. Um, yeah, and I feel you on the like not secrets like I'm lying to you, but secrets like here they are. They've been put in these places for us to kind of like find ourselves. Um, what do you feel is at stake if the system does not feel uh dance, hear, itself, right? What do you feel at stake if the system stays or decides like we're gonna stay flat? What's at stake if it
Yeah,
doesn't want contours? In this like what I want to know, I want to hear from you. What do you feel might be at stake?
I mean, it's gonna sound hyperbolic, but it's like literally everything. Like I think about the metaphor between the way that systems change perceives itself as a field, at least from my perspective, is very mechanistic. It's meant to break down a system into parts. It's meant to understand how the parts are literally connected to each other and the proverbial screws and what have you. And then that we understand how the system works. But I think what a lot of folks who are probably involved in Illuminate and like folks who've just been living in the world and had different experiences is that it's much more like a natural ecosystem. There are things happening that are invisible. There are things happening that are unexplainable, both positive and negative. They're self-reinforcing in ways which, at least at the first couple of glances, will seem incomprehensible. And so when I think about ignoring those activities or explaining them away to a certain thing is one, in a sort of emotional and evocative sense, is to miss some of the wonder of like being alive in this world. And two, when I think about that as applied to some of the crises that we're seeing today, is to choose to engage in things that exacerbate crisis rather than work to alleviate it. So climate change, like pretending as though our planet is not ill. Like I saw an article a couple of days ago saying something like 1 billion crabs have disappeared, which, one, just the number billion is like gobstopping, but also apparently, according to scientists, it's really troubling because crabs are actually like a really evolutionarily resilient species. Like generally, they've made it through like a lot of different crises over the life of this planet and generally have like not changed incredibly dramatically despite having gone through all of that. So to have crabs be
Like
succumbing
roaches.
to things now, well, yeah, I mean, like I wasn't going to get into that. They're going to be way after like that is what is going to happen. That's what's at stake. We're
They've
going
evolved.
to
They're
roach.
so fast now these
Yeah,
days.
and Twinkies, like I mean, like the things that will not die or decompose or otherwise. But yeah, when that's what I think about, like what is at stake is like our planet, like our ability just to like live alongside each other and not having some world in which, for those of us that think that this is important, finding sort of and finding and creating sanctuaries to like be in, while the rest of folks who are like living in denial like do who knows what. I think there's a very sharp departure ahead if we don't start to sort of feel both what is happening and also what is possible.
Yeah, and for those viewing this, you can read about that possibility in Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower,
Yes,
where she
it's not a fun read.
um, but you should.
Mhm.
That's the recommended reading. Um, wow. Okay, so here we are, Vanessa. Um, you have shared um so much. We've been able to harvest so much from this. I'm already thinking about like all the different resources and links that might be coming from this conversation, especially the one to your newsletter. Hey, right. Um, now I want to get to a part now around maybe some calls to action, right? Maybe some calls to action. The work that you're doing on the future of we already heard a little bit about what's at stake, right? When we don't take into account what it means to belong, what it means to create and build cultures of belonging, what it means um, to not be in the practice around possibility making, right, and building up our 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 endurance, our tolerance, our ability to hold complexity, contradictions, and that being a muscle that helps us to produce, more possibility. are there any calls to action that you have for other folks that like are into um existing into that future, and or their generations of kins existing into that future? Is there a call to action that is that might be some things that you're already asking and doing and kind of like enrolling folks in? um yeah, what are some calls to action that we can take on and do this work with you, because as you named, it's gonna require all of us. And I would say a part of it is like, yes, publicly, like for everyone, but also I'd love to hear what the call to action is for folks that are in the field and identify as and get like funding as systems change leaders.
Yes. So again, I think working somewhat backwards, like one is that um I have this new gig in philanthropy now, and like I'm excited to be building out this work. So one is if you are a funder in this space, like I would love to talk with other funders that are curious about like, what do we mean by building cultures of belonging? What do we mean by like how that might show up in this space? And so talking about that and thinking about like what might be some funder collaborative opportunities for nonprofits that are in this space. I think looking to one, like again, like naming like where in your work are you already like building belonging, and thinking about ways in which you either both or not either both and can give yourself more permission to do more of that work and attend to where people both that are sort of already in your circle as well as like folks that you were trying to influence might be looking for ways in which to come together and assisting those and to also um, make that more make it more explicit and make it more part of that. It's not to say that, if you're working on immigration, that like immigration doesn't matter, but part of immigration is noticing that every immigrants are people too. And also that like we all as a collective like benefit from immigrants being part of communities and societies and participating in arts and culture and food and work and all of the things that we all like do in a human way. And that applies for any issue that you might be working on. And then I think thirdly is like find your practice, find the thing that helps you feel like uncomfortable but also like safely. So one of our grantees, like the Othering and Belonging Institute, they have a European arm, and they just released a bunch of images in collaboration with this group called Fine Arts that all have creative visuals, like art created around like what belonging looks like, what it feels like. And so I would encourage folks to look at those images. It's a great way to maybe getting some inspiration to kind of creating that spark of possibility of what could be. And then I think there was a fourth thing that has completely escaped me. Another one that I've just been really curious about that I just like looking at is that this is a creative studio, but they on Instagram, they kind of have like nearly daily prompts. They're called Intelligent Mischief. And a lot
Oh,
of
we
what they
know
do.
them, yes.
Yes, you know them. Okay, you know them. Then yes, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically virtually every day they'll have some sort of digital like artistic collage, and there's a provocative question that's really oriented around a lot of the same questions and things that I'm focused on when thinking about belonging and systems change. Like it's a lot around like illuminating possibility. And so I think it's a really good, if your practice includes like your digital time or your screen time, it's a good way to like weave that in. So yeah, I think those were the four things I was thinking about.
Mm, um, I mean, and that is a bounty that you just offered us. Um, and I love how you make it easy. Like, look, you're already on the phone anyways. So, like it's already a practice, right? Because it's a practice. The things that you're doing over and over, what it's a practice. And so why not add some um yeah, why not create some intentionality around the things that you're doing or how you're doing them. And I love that. And I love you, Vanessa Mason. Thank you
Yes.
so much. Um, yeah, I'm so happy that we've been able to share this time together, right? That some folks have joined us. I know they're extremely grateful for being in conversation with you, Vanessa. And like continue the connection with Vanessa specifically, and also in Vanessa's work, right? And really, in any discipline that you're in, all the types of work that you are, um, they all connect, right? Especially when you're looking at doing this work, um, and affecting it systemically as well. And so, Vanessa, where can we find you? Where can we find you at?
Yes. So my Twitter handle is my name, so it's at Vanessa Mason. I tweet a lot and I think generally am open to getting DMs. So if you want to reach out to me, that would probably be the space. And then I generally try to share either interesting articles or perspectives on a lot of these questions there too. And so there's a semi-curated feed of things too, if you're looking for other kind of provocation slash inspiration in this space. Um, yeah, and then the newsletter, I'm trying to get back into hosting more frequent like events too, so those are also opportunities as those come up as well.
Ooh, nice, nice. And any other things that come up, we'll post on our site along with a recording of this video. Um, and I'd say, Vanessa, we're gonna definitely see if we can have you maybe do either like some live Twitter chat through our virtual network on Mighty Networks for Illuminate, so that folks that may have missed this session or that were here at the session want to engage with you a little bit more, they can do that there. And all these other ways, because clearly everyone should want to work with you and have you on their team, especially as we're thinking about the future,
Yes,
how we all get to be a part of it.
yes,
Yeah,
we,
Vanessa,
yeah,
thank you so much for today. Um, and I'll see y'all next time. Thank you.
thank you. Have a good evening, y'all.